Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Econothon. We're coming to you live from the World Bank headquarters here in Washington, D.C. It's 11 p.m. here in Washington, 5 a.m. in Paris, 6 a.m. in Nairobi, and 10 a.m. in Jakarta. We're starting hour 12 of our 24-hour live journey around the world of economics and development. My name is Nate Rawlings, and I'll be your host through the halfway point. A hearty welcome to our viewers around the globe, whether you're just starting your day, ignoring work in the afternoon, or whether it's way past your bedtime. For those of you who've been with us all day, I hope you've enjoyed the discussion about the ideas that are driving development. So please keep watching. Use the hashtag Econothon when you tweet, and keep sending us your questions. We have a lot more fun ahead, starting right now with the Late with Nate show, an epic quest to demystify development economics by looking at the lighter side of the dismal science. So don't go anywhere. You're watching the Econothon.
The sun's gone down, but we're just getting started. Live from Washington, D.C., it's Late with Nate. Featuring music by DJ Econ and talking with some of the smartest people in the world, Bank Group. And here's your host, Nate Rawlings.
Hello, and welcome to Late with Nate, part of the Econothon, the World Bank's 24-hour live journey around the world of economics and development. My name is Nate, and I'll be your host for the next couple of hours, along with DJ Dan to the NY Econ.
That's right, folks. Late with Nate tonight.
Danny, you made it.
All right, this is our show. We did it.
Look at your hoodie.
I know, look at this. I don't know if you guys can see that, but hashtag Econothon.
We've hit the big time.
My own things.
So all day on the Econothon, we've been exploring the world of economics. Now, economics is sometimes referred to as the dismal science because it deals with really serious issues about how people interact in a world with limited resources, scarcity, trade-offs, utility, smart or not so smart choices. And for the last couple of weeks, Danny and I have been on our own journey, more like a quest, right, Danny?
Exactly, an epic quest.
An epic quest to demystify economics by looking at the lighter side of this serious and important discipline. So we talked to economists, of course, and also data scientists, experts in governance and development, and a whole lot more. So, Danny, when we started this quest, I thought a lot about what Lawrence Peter said about economists. He said an economist is someone who can tell you tomorrow why the things they predicted yesterday didn't happen today.
Useful info.
It is, but the more smart economists we talk to, the more I realize that the power of economics as a series of principles to organize data and evidence we need to help end poverty on the face of the earth. Now, that's a critical and really difficult mission. We're going to need some of the smartest minds on the planet to solve it. Thankfully, we have a lot of them right here at the World Bank, and some of them took the time to talk to us. So now, one quick housekeeping note. We don't actually have a live studio audience with us, but thanks to the power of technology, we've estimated the gross amount of laughter from our audience all over the world and simulated it right here in the Late with Nate studio. Hit it, Danny. So anytime you hear our expert simulation, please feel free to laugh along. So, Danny, in our quest to demystify development economics, what's been most interesting to you?
Well, Nate, for me personally, I'd like to go back to the basics like supply and demand.
You mean supply, the amount of goods available, and demand, how much people want those goods?
Exactly. So I like energy drinks, right?
Who doesn't?
Exactly. And usually when I go to the store, there's plenty of drinks there. I just go in there and buy it. But sometimes when it's like finals time or people are having exams, everybody goes in there and just buys all the energy drinks and demand for it goes way up.
So I'm guessing if demand goes up, based on what we've learned, the price goes up too.
Exactly, but as we learned, the more expensive it gets, the less people buy it. So demand goes down.
And prices fall until supply meets demand again.
Bingo! Then we reach a new equilibrium, and we can restock up, and everything's balanced as all things should be. Because if we can't get our energy drink fix,
we don't have a late night show.
Exactly.
Woo! We have a great show for you tonight, putting the fun back in economic fundamentals. Stick around.
why should research only be conducted by us researchers with PhDs? We're, after all, studying folks all around the world in a way that's supposed to help them better their lives, which is a very long route towards making research matter for the poor or for anybody else. Why not give those folks, those citizens, the ability to do their own research, to design, collect, and analyze their own data? We did this at an experiment in India where 40,000 households collected their own survey data using a questionnaire that they had designed. And then we worked with the MIT Media Lab to visualize that data for them in a way that made sense to them, even though there was about only 60% literacy in that population. And we found it very effective in helping citizens manage funds that they had control over, in giving them more information about their living standards, and tracking their progress over time, making researchers basically irrelevant to the process.
Welcome back to Late with Nate on the Econothon. You know, Danny, hey, Danny.
Sorry, man. I'm just showing them my cool hoodie again.
Danny, we've talked to a lot of economists this week.
Who knew there were that many economists just running around?
I mean, this is Washington, so I figured, lawyers, right?
Everywhere.
Everywhere. So we talked to a lot of economists, and the one thing I've always been curious about, what do economists actually do?
I have no clue. What do economists do all day?
Well, we see some of the great results, but what do economists do every single day? So we went out and asked a bunch of people, some economists, some non-economists, what do economists do? And we were pretty surprised by some of the answers. So for the past couple of weeks, we've been talking to the experts, economists, development experts, governance experts, people who both collect and work with data. But we wanted to hit the streets. We wanted to see what ordinary folks, non-economists, think about both the World Bank and economics. What do economists do?
They make sure the right people have the right resources.
You must have met like a million economists. What do you think they do all day?
Make money.
They just make money.
Perfect. Economists.
Ask the right questions and find solutions to problems.
What do economists do?
I have no any idea.
I don't know.
I really don't know.
Oh, that is a tough question for me because I'm not an economist.
That is beyond my pay grade. I don't understand economics at all.
I know they help the world. I know economists help the world.
Well, here economists work to end poverty.
Help them, help the developing countries establish a more stable economic development.
Tammy, what do economists do? What do economists do?
Does the economy.
What do economists do?
The dismal science, right? What do? They try to predict human behavior.
What do economists do?
Well, that kind of stumped me. But the economists are supposed to at least give a good prescription of the development for the economy and their right attitude for the investments.
It depends very much on the level in which the economist is involved.
And there you have it, folks. A wide range of thoughts and beliefs about what economists do. But we do know one thing for certain. It is possible to end poverty. We are getting there, but we have a lot more work to do. Back to you, Nate. Welcome back to the Late with Nate show, part of the Econothon. When we talk about development economics, we often talk about resources. We talk about people's incomes and a country's GDP. But we don't talk as often about prices, what people pay for the goods and services that they use and the things that they need. But it turns out that prices are critically important to understanding poverty and helping people lift themselves out of it. Now, to help us understand more, we have a very special guest here in the Late with Nate studio, lead economist and program manager for the International Comparison Program. Please welcome Nada Hamadeh. Hi. Nada, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
So,
fun to talk about development.
It is fun to talk about development, and we really, really appreciate it. So Nada, you're an economist who studies prices all over the world. Before we jump into your work in the International Comparison Program, let's take a step back for a minute. Why is it important to study prices?
Prices are quite important, actually, Nate. They are on everybody's mind. They are on our mind when we wake up in the morning. So for us consumers, it's very important to understand how far our wages would go, how much we can buy with our wages. So suppose you have a washing machine that just broken down. You wake up thinking, can I afford the new washing machine? Now let's think about lower income economies. There they have bigger concerns. Can they afford the food that their children need? Can they afford the shelter and the health care that they need? So for all consumers, whether in high income countries or in low income countries, it's very important thing to look at prices. Now for producers as well, it's important to look at the prices of the goods and services that they are going to sell eventually. And for them, something that is quite important is the cost of the materials and the wages that go into the production of the goods and services that they produce and ultimately sell. For us economists, for us here at the World Bank, we use prices to calculate very important development indicators, from inflation, from the growth in the economy, to the cost of living. And finally, prices are very important when you're trying to compare the relative cost of living across countries or across regions within a country. So you're Americans, and many Americans, when they want to retire, they think about Florida as a destination for them to retire. And the reason is it's not just the beaches and the very nice climate that you have there. It's not the taxes as well, but it's also that Florida has a lower cost of living compared to, for example, here in Washington, D.C. or in New York.
So one of the terms that comes up pretty often is purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Yes.
What is PPP other than a brilliant case of alliteration gone awry?
Well, it's a funny acronym, and it's very popular actually. So we here at the World Bank, we use it as well to talk about public-private partnerships. So it is actually can get really quite confusing. However, if we think about PPPs in the sense of purchasing power parity, it's an ancient concept that started in the University of Salamanca in Spain in the 1500s. And then the modern definition was developed by a Swedish economist, Cassel, in 1918 after World War I. If you want to think of it, basically it is a measure, it's an index that help you compare the relative cost of goods and services across countries or across states within a country. In contrast to, for example, another important price index called the Consumer Price Index, which you hear every day on the news, I guess, because what the Consumer Price Index does, it measures the increase or decrease in the cost of goods and services over time. And this is how we measure inflation, for example.
Okay.
So PPPs is rather to measure or compare the relative cost of goods and services across countries at a certain point in time, while the Consumer Price Index is to measure the progression in the cost of goods and services over time in a certain countries. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Big Mac Index from the Economist Intelligence Unit.
No, but I like Big Macs.
Okay, that's great. I'm not a big fan of Big Macs, but the Big Mac Index is actually a miniature PPP. Okay. Because what they do is that they take one product, which is the Big Mac. The Economist, what they do with it is that they compare the price of Big Mac across all countries, and they come up with an index that compares the cost of Big Mac across countries. The PPPs, if you want, are a Big Mac on steroid, because basically we look at basically a big basket of goods and services, and this basket of goods and services does not include only products that you can buy in a grocery store, but also a lot of services, so health, education, construction. So it is more complete and more comprehensive. So it is basically on steroids, indeed.
So if Danny, if we were, I'll start that over. So you said purchasing power parity looks at a basket of goods. If Danny and I control the basket, right, Danny, we would probably have what? Bubblegum, energy drinks, candy, certainly Big Macs. But who actually decides what's in the basket? And is it one basket for the entire world?
No. Well, thankfully, I'm not the one who decides the basket. I run the program, but I don't decide on the basket. Otherwise, it will have shoes and a little bit more shoes. So thankfully, neither you nor Danny nor me are deciding what goes in the basket. The way we decide what goes in the basket starts with inputs from countries. So every country in the world will send us a list of goods and services that are very important for the consumption patterns of their populations. So for example, onion is very important in India. Bread is very important in Egypt. Avocado in Mexico, and rice in Thailand and in China. So they send us all these inputs, and we take a look at all the inputs from countries, and we try to come up with a common list of items, and that is important for the consumption pattern in a certain region or across the world. So definitely in Asia, rice will make it to the regional list. And in MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, the region I come from, we definitely should have flatbread. I mean, we cannot not eat bread every meal.
I think that, I support that. So what are the most common factors that affect prices in that basket of goods?
The factors that affect prices are usually the factors that affect both the demand and the supply of a good or a service. And these are factors that are quite important on the agenda of development banks and the development community these days. I'll give you a few examples. The government fiscal policies, because those determine the taxes and subsidies on goods and services. Monetary policies that curb inflation in a country. As well, trade wars, trade agreements, because the tariffs are impacted by those trade agreements, and those tariffs are transferred to the consumer through an increase or a decrease in the prices of goods and services. So imagine if you were to increase, for example, the tariffs on Mexico, and there will be more tariffs on avocado. The price of avocado in the United States and eventually the price of guacamole that you buy in restaurants would be impacted. Most likely.
You're getting me worried there.
I know, I'm worried too. I like avocado. What else? Climate. Climate is very important because weather conditions impact the prices of food items, because a shortage in the supply of one of these food commodities will translate into an increase in prices. Wars as well and conflict, they impact the prices of some goods and services. And finally, labor wages and labor markets are quite important because labor is, if you want, an input to the production of these goods and services. So if you were to increase the minimum wage, for example, most likely you could see that translated into an increase in prices of some of the goods and services.
So you run the International Comparison Program. This is a global partnership with development banks, multilateral institutions, around 200 countries, that collects prices around the world and produces these PPPs. So the ICP celebrated its 50th anniversary last year. What are the most important lessons that we've learned from half a century of collecting and analyzing this kind of data?
So the International Comparison Program started as a small research program in the University of Pennsylvania, and it was a collaboration between the university and the United Nations. There were 3 leading economists who started this project, Kravitz, Summers, and Haston. And it grew to become actually the largest statistical program or data program in the world, because we have 200 countries collecting a massive amount of data for a large basket of goods and services and sending them through our regional partners to us here at the World Bank so that we could produce these purchasing power parities. I think the program learned a lot over this journey, a 50-year journey. The strength of the program, we learned that the strength of the program lies in its partnership. A very strong partnership between multilateral institutions and between the countries and the national statistical offices in those countries that collect all this data. We learned as well that the program has a lot of shortcomings, or some shortcomings. The major shortcoming is that the frequency by which we were collecting the prices and producing the PPPs was 6 years. And a lot could happen in the economy in the world over 6 years. So based on the users' feedback, we decided to decrease this frequency, or to increase the frequency, decrease the time lag between the production of these PPPs from 6 years to 3 years. So now the countries are collecting price data every 3 years, and we're producing PPPs every 3 years. And eventually we would like to produce them on an annual basis. But one thing as well that we're learning lately is that with this huge technological advancements in the world, we need to change and to evolve our business. We need to evolve what we are collecting and how we are collecting it. What we are collecting, going back to what you were mentioning about the baskets of goods and services, the basket of goods and services has to change, has to evolve to include new items. Let's think, for example, about the sharing economy. So now, instead of ordering a taxi, you are calling Uber through your app on your phone. Lyft as well, Airbnb, those are all becoming important services that we have to account for when we build our basket of goods and services. Let's look at how we are collecting the data. That also has to evolve, because more and more we're finding prices online. So if you want to travel tomorrow to Europe, what do? You go online, right? So all these prices of all these tickets are online, and this is why web scraping is becoming now a reality in price data, in price statistics. You can use web scraping to collect a massive amount of data from the web and use that data to produce CPIs, consumer price indices, or purchasing power parities. At the same time, there's also many initiatives around the world with working with grocery stores. Think Walmart here in the United States or Carrefour in Europe. So you can work with them so that they can give you what we call scanner data. It's all the scanner information as you go through the scanner line. All this information that are being collected can also be supplied to national statistical offices or to us here, and then they could go into our price statistics that we are producing. So the business is evolving, and we have to, keep up with the new times.
And so when we talk about development, as we said, we often discuss metrics like GDP, median incomes. Is that really enough to understand people's welfare and their standards of living?
I think you touched upon that in your introduction very eloquently, actually. It's very important in economics to look at income per capita and to look at median income. But it's also, this is only part of the equation. It's also important to go back and look at the prices that are faced by the consumers, because you need to understand what this median income would buy in country X or country Y. You need to understand the people with this median income, what can they afford, so that you can understand better their welfare or their standards of living. And this is why in the ICP, in the International Comparison Program, a very important indicator that we produce is actually GDP per capita in PPP terms, because that indicator controls for the differences in price levels across countries, so that you can compare welfare more directly across countries and standards of living.
So were you always interested in studying prices, and when did you come to the realization that prices have such an enormous effect on people's lives?
I believe when I joined the bank, actually, 15 years ago, because only then that I started understanding how purchasing power parities and prices in general are quite important as an ingredient to the World Bank's international poverty line and global poverty measurement. So poverty measurement requires various data ingredients. These include, for example, an indicator of consumption and income, an indicator of population, so the data on population, and the data on growth, but also, very importantly, data on prices, whether it is consumer price indices or purchasing power parities. So I realized that prices are very important in understanding who the poor are and where they live. And only then can you really advise countries on how to design effective poverty reduction policies and measures.
And so finally, because we're just running out of time, what's the most powerful thing about economics?
The most powerful things about economics for me is data, because data is knowledge, is facts, is evidence. And I think only with knowledge can you really drive progress in the world.
We'll have to leave it at that. Nada Hamadeh, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
We'll be right back with more Late with Nate. You're watching the Econothon. Welcome back to Late with Nate on the Econothon. Wow, Danny, I had no idea that prices were so complex and so important.
Trust me, neither did I. I'm just a DJ.
But I think we need to expand our basket from just energy drinks and candy and bubblegum to Big Macs.
All right, Big Macs. I mean, I'm about it. I love Big Macs. You already threw me under the bus on that one, but Big Macs are my favorite food.
It would definitely allow us to fortify ourselves for the second hour of our show.
Exactly. Can we get some Big Macs in here, actually?
Yeah, some Big Macs. Anyone? Can we get some Big Macs?
They're shaking their head. All right, never mind then.
Well, while we're waiting at Big Macs, we started this quest with a big question. Can economists also be funny? Danny, what do you think? Can economists be funny?
You're asking me if I think economics can be funny? Am I allowed to say no?
So no.
Definitely not.
Well, it turns out the answer is yes, but quite frankly, you don't have to and shouldn't take our word for it. So we talked to an expert who is at the center of the subtle science and exact art of economic comedy, Dr. Yoram Bauman.
Next funny guy comes all the way from Seattle. Please welcome Yoram Bauman, everyone. Yoram Bauman.
Thanks for coming out and supporting live comedy. I stand before you, ladies and gentlemen, as the world's first and only stand-up economist. My dad told me I was crazy. Yoram, he said, you can't be a stand-up economist. There's no demand. I am killing him. I said, don't worry, Dad, I'm a supply-side economist. I just stand up and let the jokes trickle down.
Thank you, everyone, for being with us. So we have a very special guest, Dr. Yoram Bauman, environmental economist and the world's first and perhaps only stand-up economist. Dr. Bauman, thanks so much for being with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So let's start at the beginning. You studied mathematics as an undergraduate, so clearly you have a penchant for complicated things. You then earned a PhD in economics, which we know takes a very, very long time. So why did you want to study, of all things, economics for the better part of a decade?
I was actually interested in things that were a little more public policy oriented than some of the number theory stuff that I was doing in the world of pure mathematics. And I was particularly interested in environmental tax reform. So the idea that we should have higher taxes on bad things like pollution and carbon emissions, in particular, something that folks talk about now, and then use the revenue to reduce existing taxes on things we want more of. So tax bad things instead of taxing good things. That was an idea that I came across when I was an undergraduate at Reed College, took a couple economics courses, and I remember thinking that it was kind of an intellectually beautiful idea. And I have since then sort of spent the rest of my life trying to turn that idea into practice with mixed results.
It seems like every time I open a book written by an economist, one of the first things I'm greeted with is a really complicated equation. Why do economists, A, seem to make everything complicated, and B, capture that complexity in something that looks like an astrophysics problem?
I don't know, maybe you're just reading the wrong books about economics. I mean, there's been also like a whole series of pop economics books like Freakonomics and stuff that don't have any equations at all. I do think that there has been, it is interesting if you look at like economic history, there was a time when there was no math in economics books. And then I think there was sort of a period where there was really a mathematization of the field that was probably sort of in the middle of the 1900s. I think that really got going. And, part of it is that I think there was a desire to make economics more of a quote unquote hard science where, where it might have been more like astrophysics, where you could try to have predictable results, and you need math to sort of make those kinds of predictions in many cases. And then part of it possibly was kind of like an arms race where, if you didn't have math in your papers, then you couldn't get them published, and people didn't take you all that seriously. Kind of how now, if you don't have statistics in your papers, then people don't take them all that seriously.
So in your life as a stand-up economist, you take complex ideas like trade-offs, incentives, marginal analysis, inflation, and you make them accessible. How do you go about taking difficult and complex ideas and make them easier to understand?
Well, it's kind of like when I think back on my math education, for example, I don't remember a lot of the things that I learned, like when I was studying group theory, for example, or even the undergraduate thesis I wrote as a senior. But there's sort of a core group of ideas or principles that stay with you. And so what I think that has in common actually with stand-up comedy is you kind of want to try to boil things down to their essence. And in most cases, the essence of something is not a mathematical equation. Like the essence of something is an idea, like this idea of taxing bad things instead of taxing good things. And that's kind of the premise of the the work that I do both in comedy and in writing cartoon books about things is trying to figure out like how do you condense material that is sometimes complicated and mathematical, and how do you try to extract from that kind of the non-mathematical essence of it.
So in your time extracting the non-mathematical essence, what's the funniest thing you've discovered about economics?
We have a whole series of jokes in the cartoon books that try to explain in like fun but also relevant ways, like what people won the Nobel Prize in economics for. And I think I've discovered that there are a tremendous number of Nobel Prize winning ideas that can be pretty simply summarized in kind of joke form. So we have a cartoon of Gary Becker, who won the Nobel Prize for applying economic ideas to things like crime and drug addiction and things you don't necessarily think of as being economics. And so there's a frame in the cartoon book where where Gary Becker says, sometimes crime does pay, and the King of Sweden says, "Congratulations, you win the Nobel Prize." And that actually was inspired by a true story. So Jim Tobin, who was at Yale, won the Nobel Prize for portfolio selection theory, which again is complicated, and there's alphas and there's betas. But at the Nobel Prize press conference, some reporters asked him to explain his ideas without math, and he said, "Well, it's kind of like don't put all your eggs in one basket." And then the next day, headlines around the world said, "Economist wins Nobel Prize for don't put all your eggs in one basket." So that was actually kind of the inspiration for that whole series of jokes about what people won the Nobel Prize for. I think it's also pretty funny that you can do comedy anytime there are stereotypes to play with, and it turns out that people have a lot of stereotypes about economists. Economists are sort of hyper-rational and focused on money. And so I have a whole series of, you might be an economist if jokes. Like you might be an economist if you don't read human interest stories because they don't interest you. You might be an economist if you've ever gone to a bank in the hopes of getting a date. You might be an economist if you adamantly refuse to sell your children because you think they'll be worth more later. So that part of it is, I think, it's pretty fun to play with those stereotypes.
And you have a great bit in your core. One of your core videos about the 10 principles of economics explained or deconstructed, where you talk about how people don't ordinarily think at the margin. They don't go to a grocery store and say, "I'm going to buy an orange. I'm going to buy an orange. I'm going to buy another orange." But should we think at the margins? Would we be better off if everyone thought incrementally like that?
Well, so behind that joke is the idea that people act as if they think at the margin, even if they don't necessarily do that, right? So you can go to the grocery store and just get a bunch of oranges and put them in your cart without like counting them out one by one. Would it be better if people thought incrementally? I mean, I think, I'm a fairly neoclassical economist, and so I tend to think that people actually do a pretty good job of acting as if they do think at the margin, in the same way that the famous example is that pool players do a pretty good job of acting as if they understand, Newton's laws of motion when they're playing pool, even if they've never actually taken a physics class. So, I'm mostly I respect behavioral economics and the folks who say, hey, people aren't fully rational, and I get all that. But I still think that the rational model of behavior, where people do act as if they think at the margin, I still think that carries a lot of weight, and it'll get you a long way towards understanding the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, in my research for our late night Econothon segment, two of the books that I picked up and have studied, I'm holding them up for our alternative camera here. The cartoon Introduction to Economics, Volume 1, Microeconomics, and Volume 2, Macroeconomics. And what impressed me about these was they were very funny, but they include all of the complex ideas and the complicated terminology. Several of us around here have read them, and they're making it in a very understandable way. And so how do you balance the fun of these types of things with the fundamental information that you're conveying?
Part of it, I think, some of the credit goes to my co-author, who is also the illustrator of the books, Grady Klein. So he's not an economist by training, so he did a really good job of sort of bringing beginner's mind to the writing of the books, and he could sort of say, hey, this doesn't make any sense, or hey, we need to slow this down, or what about this question? I think part of it is also topic selection, especially for the microeconomics book. There's a, and I'm going to get on my soapbox here for a minute, but there's a whole bunch of microeconomics that that just feels like it's sort of Paul Samuelson from 1949, where you're studying competitive markets and there's all these cost curves and average variable cost and total cost, and you won't actually find those in our cartoon book because, one, I didn't think those were super important for folks to understand, and secondly, there was no way to make them funny, or even there was no way to make them interesting, never mind about funny. But there's a whole bunch of stuff in economics, like in introductory microeconomics, like game theory and auctions, that is really neat. And I feel like my own view is that the introductory curriculum would be much better if it had much more of that stuff that's really interesting, and less of sort of the mathematical cost curve stuff that, I'm not going to say that competitive markets don't matter anymore, but we're not living in a world where everybody's trading wheat all the time and you have this perfectly competitive market, right? You have Amazon and Google and sort of, a bunch of other topics that are really interesting to study and think about. And mostly those come from parts of the world of economics that are not competitive markets.
That was actually going to be my very next question, because we have, I think, like a lot of folks, obviously those people who work in public policy or lawyers or doctors, everyone would benefit by understanding more about economic principles. But should we be teaching economic concepts in a way that sort of apply to real people rather than sort of the way we teach it now?
Well, you want to, I'll speak mostly about microeconomics, since that's what I know more about than the macroeconomic part of things. I mean, I think that you want to try to get people interested, and then you want to figure out what you're going to leave them with. And at the end of the day, you can't leave people with very much. There's a quote that I seem to remember from, I think it was somebody who won the Bulwer Lytton bad writing contest, like named after the guy who came up with "It Was a Dark and Stormy Night." I feel like there was one of the winners there, but I can't find it online, who said, "Education is like a warm oven. The food is gone, but the heat remains." And I think about that quote a lot because I'm still not sure exactly what it means, but I really like it. It's like, 5 years after you take a class in whatever, what are you going to remember from that class? And, at most you're going to remember like a way of thinking about the world or one little thing. And so what we focus on in the cartoon book is this question, which I think is a motivating question in microeconomics, is like, under what circumstances does individual optimization lead to good outcomes for the group as a whole? Right? So when does the invisible hand work? When can you say, hey, just let people be free and have free markets and everything will be okay? And when do you end up with situations where you have the tragedy of the commons or other types of market failure like pollution or traffic congestion, where individual optimization doesn't lead to a good outcome for the group as a whole? And so I think that there's a chance that 5 years after taking an economics class, or 5 years after reading the cartoon book anyway, that people will kind of remember that key idea, and a much greater chance of that than that they'll remember average variable cost curves and where it intersects some other curve. And so I kind of feel like the introductory curriculum should be organized more around principles like that. And yeah, it certainly would help if it connected more with people's lives and the things they see in the news every day and things like that.
So you talked a little bit about some of the material, some of the concepts that were just too difficult to make funny, or too difficult, or just you can't really make them interesting. But of the material, either in the books or in your routines that you do use, what's been the most difficult to make accessible and funny?
Some of the competitive market material is pretty hard. So, I mean, the idea of competitive markets you can convey, right? Like there's this analogy in the book that competitive markets are like, it's like a beach with a whole bunch of little grains of sand, and there's no big boulders or rocks. And I think that analogy works really nicely. When you get down into the nitty gritty though, and you have to talk about margins or you have to talk about elasticities, I mean, we kind of get away with it in the cartoon book by having drawings of people being stretched out on racks like in torture devices when we talk about elasticities. So at least that makes for some fun, interesting kind of drawings. But at the end of the day, you have to do a little bit of math, and and you have to get through those formulas. And margins are just, marginal analysis ultimately is just a tricky concept especially for folks who don't understand calculus, which is what our latest cartoon book is about. It's a cartoon introduction to calculus. So if you don't understand calculus, you can get the book about calculus, and then you'll be able to understand margins. So I guess I'd say that's one other thing about introductory classes is they often, and I say this as somebody who's a math major and I love math, but I feel like there's a lot of introductory economics that's attempting to force people to replicate, kind of do imitation calculus when they can't actually do calculus. So, my druthers would be like, wait until the intermediate class when calculus is a prerequisite to do stuff that involves calculus, and in the introductory class, like, have more fun and talk about things that are more interesting and more accessible to folks who can't do calculus.
So for all the folks that we hope are watching around the world tonight, both in the World Bank and a lot of our development partners, people who are interested in development, interested in policies that improve people's lives, what's the most powerful thing about economics? And how should we use economics as we're trying to make the world a better place, improve lives, help countries?
It's a great question. I mean, I think the most powerful thing about economics is just the idea that individuals, in many cases, do act in a way that lines up with their own self-interest or what they perceive as their own self-interest. And you have to keep that in mind when you're designing policy tools, when you're thinking about how the world works, really getting a sense of, well, how is this going to affect people on the ground, and how are they going to respond? And trying to figure those things out instead of just having like I think it's easy to engage in wishful thinking and say, well, like, everybody's going to recycle, or everybody's going to turn off the lights, or whatever it is. Like, in many cases, people act the way they do because it makes sense for them to act the way they do, even if the outcomes that result from that aren't necessarily good outcomes, like a traffic jam, for example. So the economic way of thinking, I think does a really good job of sort of focusing in on that and making sure that when you're talking about trying to improve the world, make the world a better place, that the approaches that you're taking are realistic. I think the economic way of thinking is really helpful in terms of focusing on that.
And so lastly, what advice do you have for a student studying economics right now who's getting bogged down in demand curve shifts and just complicated ideas of trade-offs, efficiency, externalities? What would you tell them?
Well, a couple things. One is it depends on how far you want to go in the world of economics. My own view is that as you go from undergraduate to graduate school, a lot of it is the same kind of concepts. It's just there's more and more math. So first you do algebra, and then you do calculus, then you do multivariable calculus. So having a undergraduate degree in mathematics turned out to be quite helpful for me in graduate school. For example, the folks who really struggled in graduate school were folks who came in with more economics knowledge than I had, but less mathematical knowledge than I had. So part of the advice is to take more math classes and kind of gain a proficiency on the math side of things. The other thing that I would suggest, though, and it kind of is a good balance for that, is, keep your eyes on the prize. Like, try to think about what your ultimate goal is, and don't let all the math and formalities and whatever models you're studying right now, like, don't let them get in the way. Like, if what you really want to do is work on economic models of vaccine resistance, or improving agricultural techniques, or carbon pricing, which was what I was interested in, was pollution taxes, then make sure to balance out whatever math classes you're taking and whatever hoops you have to jump through to get through those classes. Like, balance those out with reading books, news articles, things that really focus on those particular areas that you're interested in, so that you remember sort of when you come out the other side, like, you haven't forgotten what you went in for, and you remember, and that'll also help guide your education, and it'll help keep you motivated, right? Because if what you're really interested in is making the world a better place, then sometimes it's a little hard to get through all those textbooks. But if you remember that there's this underlying goal and you have this ultimate objective, then I think it'll help folks get through.
And if you do need some help with the math, you can pick up the cartoon introduction to calculus, which will be out soon, correct?
That's right. It'll be out in the middle of July, so available wherever fine books are sold. It's excellent beach reading, and we also have, my co-author and I also have a cartoon introduction to climate change, if that's something that folks are interested in. So more details about all that are on my website, which is standupeconomist.com.
Well, it'll be out just in time for folks to pick it up when we air with the Econothon. Dr. Yoram Bauman, author of Cartoon Introduction to Economics, Volume 1 and Volume 2, Micro and Macro, and then Calculus and Climate Change, coming to a bookstore near you. Economist, comedian, translator of the complex into the sublime. Thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you. Good luck.
We'll be right back with Late with Nate, and you're watching the Econothon.
So here's the economics recipe for scrambled eggs. Find a large pan with a convex hull. There are probably about 6 people in the world who get that joke. I'm happy to see that all of them are here tonight. Put the pan on the stove and add 2 tablespoons of olive oil. If you're a Keynesian, stimulate the pan over medium heat. If you're not a Keynesian, don't stimulate the pan, just wait until the oil is hot but not smoking. It may take a while. While the oil is heating, you want to lightly beat 6 eggs. If you believe in endogenous growth theory, then only beat 5 eggs, and then later add a chicken breast. Meanwhile, you want to chop an onion into pieces so small that no one piece can affect the dish as a whole. You want to saute the onions, cook the eggs, serve immediately. If you're a Keynesian, you have to make sure to turn off the stove. They often forget that step. And finally, you want to add salt until the marginal benefit equals the market price.
Danny, we've rounded the turn, and we can see the home stretch. Many, many hours in the future. But that means we have a lot more fun ahead. So, you know, Danny, with all the great guests that we've been talking to, it's a shame we don't have time to talk about some really important topics.
Like econometrics?
Exactly. You know, I heard a story about 3 econometricians who are playing soccer.
Econometricians play soccer?
Well, in the world of Econothon, absolutely. So, true story. 3 econometricians were playing soccer, and all 3 of them had to take penalty kicks. So the first econometrician kicked the ball wide left of the goal. The second econometrician kicked the ball wide right. The third econometrician didn't even take the penalty kick. He just dropped to his knees, ripped off his jersey, and yelled, "Goal! We nailed it! We nailed it!"
Typical econometricians.
But I think the main takeaway was that none of those econometricians was Megan Rapinoe. Actually, Megan Rapinoe's penalty kicks are a pretty tough challenge for economists. Did you know that they defy the basic laws of supply and demand? Because both the demand and supply schedules for Rapinoe goals go straight to infinity.
No, I'm not giving you the laugh track for that.
In countries like Mozambique, where I work, almost all of the rainfall falls in just a few months out of the year, meaning that if you're a farmer there, you have only a few months in which to grow all of your crops, unless you have access to irrigation. But despite the tremendous potential of irrigation to expand the cropping calendar and allow farmers to grow high-value, water-intensive crops like vegetables, less than 10% of currently cultivated land is irrigated. The work my colleagues at Dime and I are doing tries to uncover both the constraints to why farmers don't adopt irrigation and how to make irrigation more efficient. For example, in Rwanda, we're finding that labor constraints are a key factor influencing whether households adopt irrigation. In Mozambique, we're finding that the timing of when farmers apply water relative to the requirements of when crops need it really affects whether there's enough water to go around for farmers in the scheme.
Nice. we've learned a lot about how much research actually goes into developing economic programs. But, you know, Danny, I'm curious, what do you think this looks like out in the field?
Yeah, I mean, what can we do with all this information?
Totally. So we got the chance to talk to a longtime development expert, a real pro who's running the World Bank's social development program in West Africa. And it turns out that with the right data and information, you can do a lot in the toughest parts of the world. Welcome back to Late Night with Nate, part of the World Bank's 24-hour Econothon, our journey through the world of economics and development. We have a very special guest, Ali Rahim, who leads the World Bank's social development effort in West Africa. Ali, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, man.
So when people think about the World Bank, the first things that come to mind are probably things like loans, grants, investments, things that have to do with money. They probably don't realize that the bank plays a big role in preventing conflict, in ending conflict, or helping to end conflict or promote stability. So can you tell us a little bit about the work you do?
For sure. You know, I like to say, you know, it took us a while, but we put the R back in IBRD, the Reconstruction Bank, back in the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So the bank was founded, as you know, to rebuild post-war Europe. And, you know, for a long time, people didn't think of conflict, fragility, and violence as something that sort of was in the World Bank's bailiwick. But I'd say going on now for over 20 years, this has become increasingly a core part of the bank's effort. So today, it's a big part of what we do. Through our financing, working in fragile states, addressing conflict, using the dividends of development to bring peace and stability to countries.
So you've spoken before about how fragility, conflict, and violence are some of the final hurdles to reach the frontier of development. What more do we need to do to overcome those hurdles?
So, you know, it's a last mile we talk about in IDA. I mean, we've made great strides, as a lot of the economists you're probably talking to, on ending extreme poverty. A lofty goal, but we're moving towards it. But that last mile, it's about these fragile states. By 2030, more than half the world's poor are going to be living in fragile and conflict-affected states. So we really have to think about how economic development can help turn the tide in these countries. So we have these security and intelligence interventions in these countries. We have humanitarian interventions, and all these are very important. But we got to be thinking about the long-term structural development changes that are really going to address the underlying of drivers and a lot of fragility and conflict in these countries. So that's what a lot of people in the bank now are turning their mind to. We have a global strategy, a new strategy on fragility, conflict, and violence that's being developed. We're trying to do more of this. You saw this. It was a special theme of IDA 18. I expect, hopefully, it'll be a special theme of IDA 19. We're realizing we've got to use this scarce special concessional financing more and more to address these problems, which are really going to deal with the last hurdle of ending poverty in the world.
So you've talked a lot about the need to think about development differently. Yeah. Are we doing enough rethinking and thinking differently about how to tackle these really complicated issues?
So I think we're starting to, but I think there's a long way to go. I think what I like to compare additionality, getting more money, with doing things differently. So I think we spent a lot of time, and very successfully, arguing for more resources for fragile and conflict states. So we got that to the tune of billions of dollars. Half of IDA 18 was devoted to go to fragile and conflict states. We created a $2 billion refugee window. We created the Global Concessional Financing Facility, providing concessional financing to middle-income countries hosting refugees. That was a first, you know, after the Syrian refugee crisis, especially for Jordan and Lebanon and other countries. So we got a lot of these new resources. Now, I think what the mindset shift for the bank and for our clients is taking that money and doing different kinds of development programs, understanding that in a fragile and conflict situation, you can't just deliver the same kind of program. Let me give you an example. You know, if we're going into a subnational area in a country that's suffering from intense conflict, going and doing a traditional capital-intensive highway construction might not be the way you do a transport project. What you might need there is a transport project that's going to be more job creating, that's more labor intensive, that might not be as technically sound, but is actually going to deliver a bigger peace dividend in that fragile area. So it takes taking our technical knowledge and our knowledge about how fragility and conflict work and bringing it together, and then looking at the local context and then about developing programs that way with our clients, because ultimately it's their project.
Well, during the Econothon all day, we're talking about the power of economics. Yeah. What role should and what role does economics play in dealing with fragility, conflict, and violence?
So I think the economics of violence, conflict, fragility are very complicated. It's about how resources are distributed, the different groups which receive resources, how rents accrue from natural resources and extractives, and how that can generate conflict and fragility, how you raise money from citizens, domestic resource mobilization. Actually, it's shown that states that effectively collect taxes and have a revenue base amongst their citizenry have a better citizen-state relationship. So, you know, it's looking at these other dimensions of economics, how inclusive growth is. All these things can be factors in conflict and fragility. So we've had a lot of great, I'm not an economist, but in order to do the work I do, I need to understand economics. I need to work with a lot of economists. And I think some of our great economic thinkers in the bank and outside the bank have really turned their mind to this issue in terms of development economics. I'd say today, this is probably one of the cornerstones now of the future of development economics.
So you're an expert in governance, conflict prevention, war to peace transitions. At what point in this process do you look at something through the lens of economics versus other disciplines, political science, history, that interdisciplinary work?
So I think the great thing about this field, perhaps, is that it brings a convergence of all these disciplines together in the World Bank. So this is a complex human and sometimes natural phenomenon of dealing with these situations of conflict and fragility. And so we need to bring the power of sociology and anthropology, understanding how societies work, understanding of politics, how governance works, understanding of economics. We need to bring all these threads together to develop solutions for our clients to address the types of things that might be exacerbating a conflict situation, the types of things that might alleviate a conflict situation. So I think economics becomes a tool amongst a basket of tools the World Bank can use to think about how to intervene in these countries.
So you served for nearly 3 years as an assistant to the president of the World Bank Group. You had a broad portfolio that included the Middle East, fragility and conflict, environment issues. During all your travels with the president around the world, what were some of the best examples you saw of how economics can shape the direction of development work? What were some of the best examples that you saw of how economics can shape the direction of development work and address difficult challenges?
So, with the last president, one thing that came sort of squarely into the center of the World Bank agenda were some of those themes you mentioned that I was a focal point on in the office, and that was with the global goods agenda. The realization that an institution like the World Bank needs to cast even higher than its individual client engagements, and that there are things we need to do to serve our clients collectively on these agendas. So at the time, the global forced displacement agenda was mounting, and we realized this is a global public bad, and this is something we need to manage collectively. So that idea of the global concessional financing facility came up, for example. On the climate change agenda, we realized that climate change is such a destructive force. The level of resources we need for our developing country clients to reach their targets on climate change are so substantial that we need to play a brokering role in having more of that financing reach our clients. So to me, a lot of what we did around creating new types of financing, thinking of new instruments, financial instruments to de-risk these countries, to make them more attractive sources of finance for financing. These were the types of innovations that always struck me most during my time there, is that we could evolve to be an institution, trying to be a financial architect for the global public bads that the world faces.
And so, staying with our economics theme of the Econothon, if a student is studying economics, let's say they're studying development economics, they really want to do the kind of work that you do. They want to work at a place like the World Bank, but they're getting bogged down with complicated equations, externalities, trade-offs, efficiency. What advice do you have for them?
So, from the outset, whether you're studying economics or whether you're studying biology to become a doctor, whether you're studying education, I'm a strong believer in that liberal arts education, especially when you're an undergraduate. And I think increasingly we're seeing in a place like the World Bank, which perhaps traditionally was much more focused just on the economic aspect our problems and the solutions, that we realize we need these interdisciplinary, integrative approaches to really tackle the world's problems. The problems of development and underdevelopment are complex human phenomena. Development economics is an essential part of the equation, so to speak, on how we tackle these. But I'd really encourage those students to have a broader range of disciplines they understand. And of course, you're going to focus in when you're a graduate student on a particular thing. But I think you benefit a lot if you can draw in a lot of these other disciplines. And I think to sort of our most creative economists and leaders in economics in the bank, people like Shanta Devarajan, who, brought all these different ideas into their application of development economics, and then really pushed the boundaries for the World Bank in how we thought about new solutions for the problems the world faces today.
And then when it comes to experience, because you spent several years as a diplomat working on conflict resolution, conflict prevention, post-conflict issues, how did that experience prepare you for the work that you're doing now? I think, what it did that was quite helpful for me is to realize that all these different actors are speaking in different idioms. They're speaking in different languages. We don't always understand each other. So a big part of finding solutions is to not think about our problem, but the problem. We've heard this before, and I think it's quite important. I think as an institution, we need to realize that given how finite development financing is, we all have to come together to use our resources catalytically. They're a drop in the bucket compared to the private capital flows today to these countries. And if we want the development finance enterprise to be successful today, we really have to think about how we use our finite resources to find much bigger solutions. And that means working with traditional diplomats. It means working with humanitarian agencies, UN agencies, INGOs, private sector actors, technology firms. We need to bring together and be conveners of a lot of different actors we didn't know. So my experience at least gave me exposure to one corner of this world. And I think if we bring more of those experiences into the World Bank, it allows us to be a more collaborative actor, which I think we are much more today than we've ever been before. So lastly, with everything you've seen and everything you've experienced, everything you're seeing now in your current job, are you hopeful for the future? I'm definitely hopeful for the future. I think I'm hopeful so long as we keep reinventing ourselves. I think the World Bank, like any major long-standing institution, constantly needs to renew, constantly needs to revisit its foundational premises, needs to question how we do things, needs to bring in new blood and new perspectives and new skills. So I think as long as we're doing that, I'm hopeful. Ali Rahim, World Bank Practice Manager for Social Development in West Africa. Thanks so much for being with us. Thank you. And we'll be right back. You're watching the Econothon. You know, Danny, one thing that's come up in our quest, it's trying to figure out what the smartest investments are, but I think it's a total other thing to get anyone to do anything about them.
You mean like behavioral economics?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure at some point the marginal utility of me having one more energy drink is low enough to where I don't need another energy drink.
No way. Listen, every single time I drink an energy drink, it's like a reset for me. So, every single time I crack open a cold one, I can maximize my utility. And we sell you some really positive externalities.
Now, that's impressive, but I'm sure a lot of folks out there need a little guidance on how to maximize their utility.
We got to make the medium the message.
Totally. Now, as it happens, we've got some really smart economists who are doing just that, and we got the chance to talk to Victor Orozco, who's helping figure out whether edutainment really works. So welcome back to Late with Nate, part of the World Bank's Econothon. So far, we've heard from economists about how they gather data and evidence and how they use that evidence to improve people's lives. But even if we know the answers to difficult questions, how do we get that message across to people? So tonight we're talking with Victor Orozco, an economist with the World Bank's Development Impact Evaluation Unit, about the best way to get that message across to billions of people. Victor, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for the invitation, Nate.
So you've been studying the impact of edutainment as a way to improve outcomes in areas like preventing HIV, reducing violence, protecting the environment. Let's start at the beginning. What is edutainment?
Edutainment is the use of mass media entertainment such as soap operas, video games, documentaries, with a goal to educate audiences, but most importantly, to positively change their attitudes and behaviors. And I have to give a very quick caveat here. I'm a researcher of entertainment education, not a producer. So before this interview, I called my producer friends, just to make sure that I made some good sense in this great interview.
So what are the most commonly used platforms right now, the sort of maybe legacy media, and why are they less effective than edutainment?
Yes, governments, development agencies are much more comfortable with billboards, pamphlets in their information or behavior change campaigns. But systematic reviews show that while they are very effective in improving awareness and knowledge, they often have very limited effects on behavior change, right? From HIV to hand washing, reading a pamphlet is not gonna motivate you, especially in the long term.
Mm-hmm. So let's take a quick look at a video about how edutainment works. So how does edutainment work, and is it a smart investment?
I think it's a very smart investment for two reasons. First, in theory and increasingly empirically, we're finding that it works in promoting behavior change. So you connecting with a character, you identifying and liking this character that adopts a new behavior, there's a good chance that you're going to be adopting that behavior as well, especially if you feel that your friends, your peers, are also influenced by this character or this TV show, for example, then a simple information campaign, as I mentioned before. On the other hand, mass media has the potential of reaching a lot of individuals, millions, billions often, at a very low cost. So for you to, say, have a massive HIV campaign, and you're using traditional formats like school-based interventions, which are still needed, of course, but you're going to need a lot of resources for teachers, NGO facilitators, while a TV drama that is very popular and that conveys in a very smart way a lot of these HIV educational messages will be potentially more cost-effective than more intense, resource-intensive interventions. That said, both have to be complemented, right? We cannot substitute sex education in schools by educational TV dramas.
So what are some good examples of where edutainment has had a big impact?
We recently completed a randomized controlled trial of the TV drama MTV Shuga. MTV Shuga is produced by MTV Staying Alive Foundation. It's broadcasted across all African countries. And this show is like Friends, no? Only with more sex.
A difficult bar to clear, but okay.
A very difficult topic, And it's very interesting because when MTV shared with us the scripts of this season we were evaluating, the research team was shocked. There was a lot of sex and rock and roll, and we thought this TV drama was going to have the opposite effects, but they proved us wrong. Basically, by having a lot of this sex and rock and roll, allowed to, on the one hand, increase audiences. It's an entertainment, right? On the other hand, it allowed them to embed positive messages in this very entertaining format. So we carried out this randomized controlled trial, and we found that after 8 months of being exposed to this 3-hour season, a very low, dosage, without any further HIV information provided, we see that 8 months after watching this season, individuals were more knowledgeable about HIV transmission. They had more positive attitudes towards HIV positive people. But most importantly, they reduced risky sexual behaviors. HIV testing doubled. Chlamydia infections were halved. Both of these indicators were objective, not self-reported. And sexual concurrency, having more than one partner in a given period of time, was also halved. Very strong results.
So is this a case where the producers of Suga embedded these messages into the script, or was there like a government agency or some type of partner that helped them decide what messaging might be best to have these kinds of impacts?
This Suga is more of a pure edutainment production in the sense that it's publicly funded, right? It's funded by African governments, by PEPFAR, by UNAIDS, by UNICEF, by the Elton John Foundation, and the Gates Foundation.
So what is the best balance of education, messaging, and the entertainment aspect of it? Is this a case where, or from your research, have you found a nice balance where the educational message is something that you have to hide deeply within the drama, or can you be more explicit with that messaging up front?
It depends on the objective of the intervention. For example, TV shows reach people in their day-to-day activities where you have to make sure they watch, they tune in to your show. Because if they don't tune in, there's no effectiveness, right? However, school-based interventions that include edutainment screenings and activities, then you could be much more explicit about the educational messages because, well, students are already tuned in and they're expecting educational messages anyway. And there's some very good research that shows that when audiences, especially youth, realize that entertainment shows have a preachy objective, they tune out. And in fact, there's been some research that shows there could be some boomerang effects. People just don't like to be preached at, and especially youth, it seems.
So is television the most popular platform for this kind of education messaging, and what other tools have you seen that are effective?
Television is very effective for reaching people on their day-to-day activities. But as you can imagine, increasingly people are watching their TV shows online, Netflix and the like. But also today, 7 out of 10 adults own a smartphone. So increasingly, individuals were also going to be watching TV shows on their smartphones. So I think there's a lot of potential on audio visuals, right? But also, let's keep in mind that not everyone has access to these technologies. Radio in many developing countries remains the main media outlet. And there's a lot of very good edutainment productions that use radio as their media mechanism.
So have you seen, and with the research that you've done, any particular regions or cultures where this works best, either because there's a really popular drama or soap opera, or just a platform that brings people together?
Hard to tell. To make regional comparisons, I'm from Latin America, where, from Mexico specifically, where several decades ago it was the capital of the soap operas, but now Turkey, Brazil, Korea produce soap operas that are watched beyond, not their own borders, but beyond their regions. So I think that a well-told story is something universal. It's something that's been around thousands of years. How a lot of cultural norms, stories, the story of the hero that all cultures have been told through stories. So I think that there's a good chance that regardless of the media outlet, a well-told story will be very influential across different development sectors.
And so what kind of skepticism has edutainment met with, and what can we do to overcome that skepticism?
My experience in this sector is that the evidence base remains mostly qualitative or observational. So to the question, does this work? That causal question, does it work? And is it a smart investment? That has increasingly being answered, but very recently. So part of the research program in DIME that I'm leading on entertainment education aims to strengthen this evidence base, where we're evaluating documentaries, movies, TV shows, video games, across different development sectors: gender empowerment, education, HIV, gender-based violence. So we could show with this hard causal evidence that it works, and if it reaches large audiences, that is a very cost-effective, a very smart investment for development partners.
So what is the scope of edutainment now, and what's the growth potential over, say, the next decade?
Huge potential. As a percent of behavior change campaigns supported by development agencies and government, it remains a very small fraction. So a lot of space to grow there. On the other hand, we have companies like Participant Media, Netflix, that are increasingly creating very high quality content of movies, TV shows that include social messaging at its core. So I think in the next few years we're going to see more and more investments. But again, as I mentioned previously, I think that a strong evidence base that shows that it does work to change attitudes and behaviors is something that is likely to bring in more resources to a sector that remains a one-off sector, unfortunately.
And so throughout the entire Econothon, we've been talking about the power of economics to guide development and improve people's lives. What drove you to study economics?
I had a cushy life in DC as a kid. My dad worked in NIH, but when we went back to Mexico, we went back in the middle of the economic crisis of 87, 88. And I just saw inflation basically doubling prices in a very short period of time, massive unemployment. And this motivated me, excited me to look for options, policy options for governments to do responsible policy making to avoid this economic crisis.
So how did you become interested in the impact of edutainment? I believe it was first part of your doctoral research and now part of your professional research here at the bank. What drove you to that field?
From a research perspective, seeing a series of studies of behavior change campaigns showing that these traditional formats were not working. But also this just confirmed my common sense experience of my own self, where I know that I need to eat healthier, exercise more, save more, and not doing it. So information is not an issue. It's just sufficient motivation. And there's a lot of good research that shows why this is the case, right? So the modern part of the brain, the rational part, is often beaten by the primitive, the reptilian part of the brain, the one that says, give me food, give me satisfaction, today at the expense of a more responsible future, decision making. So the World Development Report of 2015 mentions edutainment as a potential tool. And then I think, again, makes a lot of sense from both a research point of view as well as from a personal point of view.
So for all the potential many producers or writers who are watching this show in the middle of the night here in the States especially, should producers and writers put a behavioral economist in their writer's room and figure out how to embed good messages that improve society into their stories?
I think that would be a very good idea, which I've had the opportunity to work with the script writers of MTV, of Discovery Foundations, and I've seen them, at their element. Where, while we were bringing some of the insights of behavioral economics, they, in a way, without mentioning that specific paper or that specific term, they knew about it. They're experts on how to reach the hearts and minds of people. They know what motivates people, what shames people into behavior, into adopting certain behaviors. They know very well human nature in a way. And that said, they often have public health and psychologist experts providing feedback to these scripts. But I think development has a lot to learn from this model of bringing together the storyteller with the behavioral economist and other development experts.
And so what advice do you have for students and young people who want to improve people's lives around the world in terms of either what to study or what fields to go into? What would you tell them?
Study a lot your field, right? If you're an economist, get your math right, get your optimization math correct. However, always be open to other fields, especially those that relate to the field you're studying, right? Behavioral economics is a very good example where it brings insights from psychology, sociology, that just shows that complex problems need very often complex solutions. And if you just look the solution from your very specific, narrow field of inquiry, then the chances are you're going to be missing many other things that drive, in this case, human behavior, a very complex issue. So again, study a lot your own field, but always be open, always be reading, always be talking with people from other fields, especially those related to yours, to enrich any potential solutions you could be advocating once you become a development professional.
And so lastly, before we let you go back to all your research and your work, what's the most powerful thing about economics?
Something that really is exciting about economics is that when it answers questions around if a policy or a program works, it uses models that make very explicit the mechanisms through which a program or policy works. And if it has high quality data like an impact evaluation does, then you can empirically test not only if the program worked, but through which mechanisms it worked. That I think is the most powerful thing of economics.
Victor Orozco, economist with the World Bank's Development Impact Evaluation Unit. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for the invitation.
You're watching Late with Nate, part of the Econothon. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Late with Nate on the Econothon. You know, Danny, in our epic quest to figure out what economists do, it turns out the answer was right in front of us all along, in a place called the Development Research Group.
An economics miracle.
This week we had the chance to talk to Owen, Ozier, an economist and an engineer, who showed us the tip of the iceberg and everything underneath it. So in our ongoing quest to discover what economists do, we've come to the Nerve Center, the Development Research Group, which is here on the third floor of the World Bank Group. And we're looking for an actual economist who can tell us what economists do. Owen Ozier, you're an economist.
Hi.
Can you tell us what economists do?
Sure. Should I show you?
Sure.
Yeah, all right. So when you think about what economists do here at the World Bank or anywhere else, you think about the result, okay? You think about the little tables of little numbers, and you think about the graphs that depict the findings that we have. And this is what we need for policy here at the World Bank. You want to know the impact of a social program designed to improve health services in Nigeria. You want to know the impact of an education program designed to improve literacy outcomes in a place like Kenya. You might want to know how different disciplines approach the same social science questions that we need to know the answers to in order to do policy here at the bank. Underneath all of that, behind the scenes, under the hood, we have all of this. In this green, you're seeing some of the math that we use. Math is the underpinning of every single piece of the analysis here, whether it's what discipline approaches things in a different way or how much a child has learned from a storybook. Okay? So you've got linear algebra, you've got calculus, you've got statistics, you've got probability. This is the math. These are the gears that turn to power the machine that produces this result. You've got statistics here in the purple. You've got when you test more than one hypothesis. Maybe you want to know whether an employment program improved income, improved hours worked, improved leisure time, improved food security. That's 4 different hypotheses. There's a long history of the statistics of how to adjust for the fact that you're testing more than one hypothesis. And that's what we're doing here. Down in the corner, you've got calculations about sample size. You know you want to detect an effect. You know you want to go out and measure whether a program makes an impact. How many observations are you going to need? How many households or clinics are you going to have to survey? That is the answer being given here. This is what data look like when they're still being cleaned. All of this is what you need in order to produce the answers like this that inform policy. This is what we deliver. This is how we deliver it. That's economics.
So in other words, after you and your fellow economists have done all the hard work, it's really not that complicated.
That's the plan.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Welcome back to Late with Nate, part of the Econothon. You know, Danny, we talked to some really smart economists about how they take all the data and evidence and figure out how to design the best development programs. But one thing I've always been curious about, where do they get all the data?
Exactly. I mean, I'm always just like hearing, we gotta crunch the data and stuff like that. But I mean, they should probably have a class like that in elementary school because, I mean, where do spreadsheets come from?
Turns out there's an expert on that right here at the World Bank.
No way.
So this week we got to catch up with Raka Banerjee, an expert in data collection, to find out where do all those numbers come from and what do they have to do to get them. Hi, welcome back to Late Night with Nate, part of the World Bank's Econothon. Since it's middle of the day in many parts of the world, we're having coffee in the middle of the day with Raka Banerjee, and we're going to be talking about data, information, and where it all comes from. So Raka, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So your title, and I have the full title here, is Project Coordinator in the Development Data Group at the World Bank, correct? That's 11 words. Since this is only a 2-hour show, and since you used to host a fantastic podcast called Between Two Geeks, in the interest of brevity, can we call you a data geek?
Yeah, please.
Awesome. So, well, let's start at the beginning. How did you become a data geek? Were you always interested in data? How did you train?
I honestly just kind of fell into it. It all started, actually, there was a specific course I took during my master's program called Development Economics, taught by Professor Craig McIntosh. And after one of the lectures where he was railing about how, you know, Africa is just a graveyard of development projects where people go, you know, build a well and then just leave. You know, he was just sort of ranting like, don't ever be one of those expats who's in there complaining about, you know, the locals and how difficult it is to be here. And afterwards I went up to him and I was like, I would love to do this work. So I got involved on an impact evaluation with him and with an economist here at the World Bank. And I went to Malawi to run the field work for the 3rd round of a impact evaluation on looking at the effect of conditional versus unconditional cash transfers on HIV risk for young women in Malawi.
Wow, it's a big project.
Yeah, it was.
So in your excellent blog that you've done here on the World Bank website, you've written that the idea that every data point has a human story. So let's look at some of the data points. By your own estimation in your fieldwork, you've had 3 near-death experiences, at least, endured probably around 357,000 bureaucratic delays, and spoken with thousands of people, all to collect data. Why are those individual data points so important?
I think that, you know, it's something that people don't really think about. You know, when you see the data point on your computer screen, it's like, oh, that's the number, and it seems very clean and official. But to get every single one of those data points, you knock on doors, you go and sit down with families for hours to ask them, what material is your roof made of? How much of this certain grain did you consume over the last week? It's very intense and it's very personal. So that's sort of what that idea is, that every data point is a human story, that there are real human lives behind each of these numbers.
So how do we collect data? Is it just like the people who walk up to you on the street and ask you to sign a petition? Do you walk around and individually count things? How does all this work?
So we actually send people out to people's homes. And sometimes they're not there. We have to reschedule. But we're relying on people, basically on their kindness, to let a surveyor into their home and talk with them for, could be up to 3 to 5 hours over multiple days, to ask all sorts of questions. So it's very intense, and sometimes, generally there's a preference not to give any sort of gifts, just to make sure that the data is not tainted in any way. But sometimes we'll offer like a bar of soap at the end. Okay. So.
And so people will tell you their whole life story just for a bar of soap.
Well, I think they do it because they're aware that this data is ultimately going to help the government, design policies, design programs that can help better people's lives. But as remuneration, there is a bar of soap.
Nice. And so what's the most difficult data collection effort that you've done, or probably the most interesting?
The most difficult that I've done was a research experiment on measuring cassava productivity in Zanzibar. So it was one where I was basically involved in every step of the process, from designing the questionnaire to running the fieldwork to processing the data. And it was a lot of time standing around cassava fields in the hot sun, kind of like this, but much hotter. Training, we were working with agricultural extension workers who haven't really been involved in surveys, so we had to train them on how to conduct a survey. The training was going really poorly until I realized that most of them were elderly and needed reading glasses, so it went a lot more smoothly after we bought them reading glasses.
So you got every one of them reading glasses?
Yes, yeah. Well, it was sort of like one person raised his hand and said, I can't read this, and then, sort of everyone else raised their hand.
Do what you got to do to get it done. So why is it important to measure things like cassava production in Zanzibar?
It's really important for food security, actually. So cassava is a staple crop in a lot of countries, so sometimes people will grow it, not necessarily even planning on harvesting it, but just in case their main crops fail. It can be harvested year-round, so it's really helpful for kind of smoothing that consumption over time. But it's difficult to measure because it's harvested over time. So something like maize, people will harvest it at one time in the year, so it's easier to recall that number, like how much they harvested in a survey. But with cassava, since they might just harvest what they need for breakfast for that week, right? So it's kind of like if I were to ask you, how many pounds of oatmeal did you eat over the last year?
I would have no idea. 50 million pounds of oatmeal? Yeah.
Me too.
Like 10 pounds, probably 10 pounds of oatmeal at least.
So that's why we gave farmers weighing scales and diaries where they could weigh the cassava that they harvested and record it in a diary. And then we experimented with having people go and visit them to check if they're recording versus having people call them. And then we compared that to how cassava is traditionally measured, which is cassava production, which is you go at the end of a year or after 6 months and say, how much did you consume? Right.
When people aren't sure how much they've consumed, so this is a much more accurate way to measure.
Exactly, yeah. So, and ultimately it will help the governments better prepare for, if there's famine, if areas are suffering from food insecurity.
So it sounds pretty labor intensive. Once we collect all this data and do all this work to go out in the field, talk to people, get all this information about their lives, what do we do with it all? Do we add it up with a slide rule? Do we throw it into some big bucket and kind of look at, what do we do with all the data?
I mean, yeah, that's the ultimate question. For some surveys, like I used to work for the Living Standards Measurement Study team. The data is collected on a wide range of things, from education to fertility to food consumption. So people can do any number of things with the data. You know, you could compare what does the food security of a household where maybe a female-headed household with this amount of education compared to, you know, another household with much less education. So ultimately the idea is to design programs, design policies that can help make life better for people.
And so we've heard a lot about how all of the devices that we have, our phones, things in our house, collect data, but with the Internet of Things, more devices are going to be collecting data. How will the fact that more devices are going to be coming online and bring more and more data, how is that going to affect just how we collect and use data?
Yeah, it's really a sea change, and I think people in the statistics community and the data community are really, you know, struggling with this right now, because before it was a matter of, you know, collecting data. Now it's like there's too much data. You know, what do we do with all of it? How do we make sense of it? So big data. There's a great little series on should this thing be smart that I read on Slate, where it's like looking at a smart mug, a smart socks. You know, like should this thing actually be smart?
Paper cup.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's still in process to determine, you know, how do we use this data for something that's actually useful, right? How can we use it to make people's lives better, right? There's so much data all the time. I've heard of it talked about as like data exhaust. Like as we walk through the world, we're leaving this like trail of data behind us, you know. But how can we actually use that for designing programs, policies? That's sort of still, I think, remains to be seen.
The big question. And so, do you think we'll ever become inundated with data to the point where it doesn't help us anymore, or is more data always better?
I don't think that more data is always better. I mean, we can certainly see how like data privacy is increasingly an issue. We're still, you know, don't have sufficient data regulation. I think that the real sweet spot is when you can find ways to combine the big data that we're seeing now with sort of traditional data like household surveys. So that way it's validated across, you can validate the big data with something that's actually concrete. But yeah, I think that more data is not always a good thing.
So for the folks watching around the world, if someone is really interested in data and they find this really fascinating, how do they become a data geek too?
That's an awesome question. So the World Bank, I think it was almost a decade ago now, we went ahead with this open data initiative. So all of the data that is compiled by the World Bank from countries is available to the public free of charge on data.worldbank.org. So that's a great place
wherever
to
I
start.
am in the world, I can go data.worldbank.org, just get the data sets and start looking at it?
Yes, exactly. And you can do whatever you want with it. There's, you know, now lots of data visualization tools, and, you know, I think the more people that get involved, you know, the more we can all benefit from the data that's already out there.
Nice. Well, I hope all of you will check out data.worldbank.org and fulfill your dream of becoming a data geek if that's what you want to do. So, rock up energy, data geek, all around rock a star. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it.
Nate. Bye.
Globally, water supply is more popular than sanitation, even though sanitation, the benefits of investing in sanitation are higher. The economic returns on sanitation spending is $5.5 for every dollar invested, whereas for water supply is $2 for every dollar spent. The total costs of inadequate sanitation are estimated at $260 billion, or on average 1.5% of a country's GDP. Countries who invest in sanitation could reuse their savings to invest in other sectors that would grow their economies. Also, poor sanitation has been linked to malnutrition, deaths, diseases, and stunting. Therefore, investing in sanitation is investing in human capital.
Woo! Nice. Thanks so much for watching our show and for taking part in our epic quest to demystify development economics. Thank you to DJ Dan to the NY Econ and to all of you for helping us understand what's possible when we use data and evidence to tackle the world's biggest problems. And a special shout out to my parents, Millie and Peter Rawlings, who are celebrating their 43rd wedding anniversary tonight by watching the Econothon. Love you guys and congratulations. So the Econothon continues with some of my favorite videos over the past year. And then at the top of the hour, my colleague Noriana Fernando and her team are going to take us to South Asia. So Noriana, what are we going to see?
Oh, we have some real exciting stuff and panelists lined up. We are talking about urbanization. We're talking about women's participation in the labor force and human capital, a personal favorite of mine. And particularly as a South Asian woman, I am so excited to hear what some of these panelists have to say. But more than anything, I'm excited to hear from you guys. So be sure to agree, disagree, comment, and respond. Back to you, Nate.
Great. Well, stay tuned. Keep tweeting at us with the hashtag Econothon. And thanks for watching and stick around. You're watching Econothon.